Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen, a show where we just sit around, we talk about games, we talk about fantasy, we talk about role-playing games, board games, all with an eye to a designer and a GM's point of view. I'm JM, your host. Welcome to the Mr. Bob Crumb first in chat, and to Grom, good morning to everyone. I hope you have your cup of coffee, and we're going to dive right into the newest segment in this Exploring Fantasy series that we've been doing. This is where we talk about Grimdark. Yes, Bob, you hit the nail on the head. So let's talk about Grimdark. So the genre of Grimdark comes from a line actually in Warhammer 40k. The Warhammer 40k tagline is, "In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war." And that's where the genre gets its name, although it starts long before that. Hey, Padre, good to see you. Grom, I hope you have your cold caffeine. I'm not sure what that would be. I mean, cold brew is delicious, but iced tea, perhaps? So, let's start with, today we're going to talk about our sources of Grimdark and kind of what defines the Grimdark genre. So, there's a great magazine called the Grimdark Magazine, and they put out an anthology called Evil is a Matter of Perspective, an anthology of antagonists. And they got some of the great Grimdark authors to contribute to this. And R. Scott Baker wrote the essay at the start of it called On the Goodness of Evil. And we're going to talk a lot today. I'm going to try and keep it from straying too far into philosophy, but it's me, so who knows where we're going to be at. He starts his essay off with, "There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so," which comes out of Hamlet, right? It's where Hamlet is speaking to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And while I don't agree with the relativism of that statement, it is sort of the source of Grimdark and why we like Grimdark fantasy. It is a matter of perspective shift. So in a lot of ways, Grimdark, and I realize I'm not defining it yet. I've got to build up to it. So Grimdark is a response to epic fantasy, specifically to Tolkien. So Tolkien and epic fantasy gives us this world where, as Lewis put it, everyone's insides are on their outsides, right? The horrible people, the evil creatures often have some sort of physical disfigurement. The good creatures are noble and pure, but even that's a simplistic view of Tolkien, right? Because we have Strider, who is the true king. But what does Frodo say about Strider? If he was truly the enemy's servant, he would look fairer and be fouler. But yet we have this, epic fantasy we talked about, right? There is good, there is evil, there's a clear, stark morality that separates the two. And in some ways, Grimdark or epic fantasy takes us back to a more idealistic view of fantasy. Grimdark is a response against that. It's a reaction to that. Instead of mythologizing the fantasy, it attempts to realize the fantasy, make it more realistic. At least, sadly for us, our modern view of realistic, if you will. Now, I love Grimdark fantasy. A lot of people consider it to be more adult or more realistic or less childish, I should say. Although Grimdark does tend to stray into, let's call it, more R and NC-17 topics because it's more realistic. And there's a phrase that has come out of a group of friends down here that has become very near and dear to my heart. It came out of one of my friends, Richard, who is a co-host with me on the on the Grand Campaign podcast. He runs a Dante night where people read through Dante with him. And they got to end of Canto 8, beginning of Canto 9, if I remember correctly, where they are stopped by the Furies. And the Furies are like, that guy's alive. We're going to kill him. In fact, we're going to summon the Medusa to turn him to stone. And Virgil, for the first time, we see him actually ruffled by this, right? And he covers Dante's eyes and he says something along the lines of, "There are things so evil in this world that one should never try to look at them. And so if you think about turning to stone as being a symbol or an allegory for despair, right? When you are in the depths of despair, you cannot move forward, you cannot move back, you cannot distinguish the future from the present. You are turned to stone. And so we have this phrase down here among the gaming group, don't look at the Medusa. When you look at the Medusa's story, how does Perseus kill the Medusa? Well, he can't look at the Medusa, but he looks in a mirror, and the reflection provides enough distance for him to be able to slay the Medusa. And so I think that's the purpose of grimdark fantasy. Now, granted, 3 standard deviations out. There are a ton of authors out there writing grimdark who just enjoy the lewdness or the vulgarity they're putting onto the page, and there are people who read grimdark authors like that because it gives them some sort of sick enjoyment. And I'm not going to talk about 3rd standard deviations. I'm going to talk about the main standard deviation. Hey, Rook, good to see you, sir. But I will say, and speaking of butts, demons do play butt trumpets in Dante, and I find that hysterical. So, I think the true enjoyment and the true purpose of grimdark fantasy is it allows us to hold up a mirror to our own problems and not look at evil directly on, but look at evil through the mirror of grimdark fantasy. So, now that I've talked a lot around it, and hopefully everyone is following with me, let's talk about where it came from. And in a lot of ways, grimdark fantasy is the partner of Bronze and Iron Age comics, right? We had the Silver Age of comics where things were light and funny and goofy because of the comics code, and they couldn't do anything kind of more serious with it. We had Batmite and Batman of Zuenar. I always forget that. The Technicolor Batman. We had a Superman being exposed to every color of the rainbow of kryptonite for a kryptonite of the week sort of thing. Yes, Bosch's paintings. Bosch does a beautiful job at rendering Dante. I actually really want him to do some, or would have liked him to do some Warhammer Fantasy art. How great would that be? And so we had this reaction from it. At the end of the Silver Age, we hit, really, The Dark Knight Returns as one of the first, in my opinion, true Iron Age stories. And a part of that is Frank Miller realizing that he was going to be older than Batman that year. And so he needed to push Batman all the way to the end of his life. But we had stories like Spider-Man dealing with Harry's drug addiction. We had Speedy going through drug addiction. Gwen Stacy dying. We had weight put back to the stories, and in some ways the pendulum then swung very heavily into the Iron Age, which you had Punisher, you had Rob Liefeld doing Cable and X-Force, and in some ways Kingdom Come represents the kind of self-recognition that we have pulled back from that dark comics, and where would that actually lead to? And I think Mark Waid does a beautiful job of rendering the Book of Revelation and the end of the DCU well, kind of as a response to the Iron Age. So anyway, grimdark is the same thing. Fantasy, for a lot of people, had stayed in a Tolkien run. We had Tolkien, and we had still like great authors. We had things like The Wheel of Time, but they're all kind of in that same vein of story where good and evil were very clearly defined. Hey, Mark, good to see you here this morning. And so, one of the first grimdark fantasy authors is Glenn Cook. If you know Glenn Cook's story, it should come as no surprise that Glenn Cook wrote darker stories. The Black Company is set in a world, but it's all seen through the eyes of the soldiers who fight the wars. It is dark, it's gritty, you don't know who's going to survive. And in a lot of ways, it sort of set up this new way of looking at fantasy. Thieves' World brought in some of that. We talked about that last week. So let's bring it to today. Who would I consider kind of the four great grimdark authors of our time? Well, we'll start with an honorable mention. And I'm going to call it an honorable mention because, one, he hasn't finished his series. And two, I think sometimes he strays into that third standard deviation. And that's George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin is writing a reactionary story to Tolkien because he doesn't think that Tolkien gets the world. And I don't think Martin gets Tolkien. But that's neither here nor there. And so Martin presents this world where, right, the character that we think, according to the rules of fantasy, should survive, Eddard Stark. And this is, I'm not even going to put a spoiler warning here, because if you haven't seen the show or read the books, at this point, it's, you know, the statute of limitations has passed. Dies at the end. He gets his head cut off because honorable people, they don't actually win. They usually get murdered by devious people. And there's a cynicism to Grimdark. There's a look at reality and said, there's no way that Tolkien's way could work. Here's the way the world actually works. And it's very easy for grimdarkness to slip into nihilism. The idea that, well, if there is no good and evil, if it's only a matter of perspective, then only the ends matter. And so whatever means we need to get to the ends. And they act, I think, ironically, they act as morality plays for us, for looking at what happens when we give into these the ends justify the means mentality. I'm with you, Bob. There's, at this point, yeah. So some people like to say that Erikson and the Malazan series are grimdark, and if you think that, I suggest you go reread all 10 books, because the core of Malazan's theme is compassion, and how compassion is the defining trait of humanity, which is not something that jives with grimdarkness. So, top 4 sources for grimdark fantasy. I would say probably the most well-known is Joe Abercrobby, who wrote The First Law. He wrote Trilogy. He wrote 4 books in between: Sharp Ends, which is a short story anthology; Best Served Cold, which is a revenge heist story; The Heroes, which is a war story; and Red Country, which is a Western, all set in his fantasy world. And then he wrote the Age of Madness trilogy, which brings us into sort of the industrial age in that world. Which was very interesting. Like, I really enjoy the Joe Abercrombie series. I know that my friend Chris did not, because you get to the end and it all falls apart for the heroes. You find out that the people who were supposed to be raising them up were actually just manipulating them. That at the end of the day, is there any true victory, or is it just, you know, plaster on the cracks and makes you think that it's a victory? How often does the hero actually have the heroic origin, and how often is that sort of nudged and manipulated in the background? Yes, Padre, Martin's story is War of the Roses, and even his most shocking inventions are really just historical things kind of pulled in. I think he relies a lot on the fact that the study of history is not deemed as important as it once was. And so he's able to cherry pick from history, which, again, all authors do. That is not a knock on Martin. But he's able to kind of use that shock value because these things have kind of fallen by the wayside. Richard K. Morgan, who is most known for his Altered Carbon series, the Takashi Kovacs series. He wrote a trilogy of grimdark novels called A Land Fit for Heroes, which, if you pay close enough attention, you will discover is actually a far future sequel to Altered Carbon, and Kovacs appears in the fantasy series. But it too is grimdark. The choices that get made. The morality is very muddied. Like, morality is almost set off to the side. You will definitely have characters who are seen as evil, seen as good, but very rarely is it ever more than a matter of perspective. It's sort of, we'll come back to the monster discussion, because there's a really good monster discussion that ties in with grimdarkness. Anna Smith Spark wrote the Empires of Dust trilogy, which the prose verges on the poetic. Like, I highly recommend the audiobooks, even though it might be a little bit harder to to follow, just so you can hear the cadence of her words. And her story is about addiction. Like, the trilogy is about addiction and the struggle to beat it, the fall back into it, and the rise. And what the character is addicted to is essentially the antagonist of the story. She knows he's evil. She knows that he is most likely to kill everyone in the world, but she can't help but bring him back from the dead every time because, well, she says she loves him, and at the end she realized she was just addicted to him. And then, I know we've talked a lot about this, but R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse trilogy. No spoilers, but let me just, if you decide to read it and you get to the end of the final book and you go, what? Just remember the name's on the tin. Don't be surprised. So, those are exemplars. And much like Martin, R. Scott Baker, his first trilogy pulls from history. It is the first Crusades in this fantasy world. I would say Baker is probably the closest to Tolkien in my mind is creating another real world. It feels real through the whole thing. Yes, The Witcher does stray into Grimdark, but still, and I haven't finished all of The Witcher, but as I understand it, The Witcher still ends with this hope for the future, that there is good and good will triumph over evil. That is not even a discussion that happens in Grimdark. Grimdark leans into the idea that from another point of view, no one is evil. Everyone is the hero of their own story. And I think that comes back to monsters. And we may have had this discussion before, but right, when we look at how monsters are used in fiction and in history, we can see there's this continuity, this arc that monsters have taken, right? There is what, in the ancient world, monsters were chaos. They were the thing that was left over from the world. They were partially divine. They came in to destroy what you loved, what you held dear. They came to destroy civilization. So we had to have semi-divine heroes to go out and deal with that. Or in the case of David, divinely inspired heroes to go out and deal with that. So monsters as chaos is kind of our first thing. As we move into kind of the medieval time, we have monster as tyrant, right? Mordred. What is Mordred in the Arthurian saga? Well, Mordred's the guy who wants to take the established civilization and use it to brutally dominate everyone under it and live at the top of the heap. And so you have to have sort of the divine right of kings. You have to have Roland and, oh man, who's the guy who is Roland's, like, who is the focus of the Song of Roland? My brain just died. He wields the sword. Anyway, I'm sure someone in the chat or the comments will remember it. All right, we have monster as tyrant. When we hit the modern age, what do we have? Well, we have monster as bureaucracy. There is no clearer sign of this than I think than the Screwtape letters in fiction, right? How is hell set up? Well, hell is a bureaucracy, right? That's kind of how it's all set up. Even so, going back to evil as tyrant, monster as tyrant, Milton, right? That's the point of Milton's Satan. So we get to evil as organization, right? Evil as very banal, sort of grinding society under its wheels. And so people react to that in different ways. The heroes who try to stop it either destroy the system, subvert the system, right? 1984 is sort of a grimdark view of that type of evil. And then we get to the modern times, which is evil as us. The idea that, well, that person isn't evil. They just, from a different point of view, all of their choices make sense. And that's the core of grimdark fantasy. The idea that if you could just understand the other person's point of view, maybe they wouldn't be evil. Which means everyone is evil to someone else. And it holds up a mirror to our society. Yes, Padre, World War I, the bureaucracy. World War II is another defining view of that, sort of the organized war machine that enabled mass deaths to be programmatically carried out. So that's the discussion of the origins of Grimdark. Kind of starts with Glenn Cook, Thieves' World, Martin, and kind of has evolved in this own thing that's a reactionary to what some people view as the simplistic. But we talked about that in epic fantasy. It's not simplistic. It's just mythologized. Grimdark can tend to stray into the not. I'm going to quote Big here. Not mythologizing enough. It's so realistic. It's so grim. Why would we want to look at it? Well, we look at it because it provides a mirror. It prevents us from looking at evil head on. But we can kind of see the reflection. It allows us to explore and look at things that are very dark in our own society. For example, violence tends to be grittier, grimmer, bloodier. No one is safe. When you get into a fight, people die. In Grimdark fantasy, that violence carries into all aspects of life. Political, domestic, sexual. That may have just pinged YouTube's monitoring, but we're gonna kind of do our best to talk around it. And it's awful. Sometimes it's very awful to read. But I would argue that it's no less awful than what's actually going on in the world. And sometimes we can't look at that. But we need to be reminded that it exists. And in fact, Baker kind of talks about it. He gets blasted sometimes for his books. But he's like, listen, Martin writes all of these scenes, but he only ever writes them from one perspective. So is that really his... He hides behind the shield of history, like, oh, well, this just happened in history. Well, if you're actually going to do it, if that's your shield, you need to hide. You need to not hide behind it, but understand that you're shining a light on it. But also, we've become kind of comfortable with certain types of violence to certain types of people in fantasy. And Grimdark goes, we're just going to pull that open. Are you really comfortable with this in your fantasy? Grimdark as a genre makes us uncomfortable, or should, at its best, make us uncomfortable with the evil that is in our world and the evil that we allow to slide past us. You are late, but that's fine, Phantom. We are in the grim darkness of... at 10 o'clock, there's only grim darkness. In the grim darkness of behind the screen, there is only ranting? I don't know. Oh, good. Thanks, Bob. Good to know how the algorithm works. All right, so Padre, let's talk about that. There's a really interesting look. You're talking about wars and how they affected people. And on a complete side note, because this is behind the screen, half the show is scripted and the other half is me interacting with the chat. Look at the difference between Darkseid and Thanos. On the surface, they're nearly identical characters. They even have a similar look to them. But Kirby is writing after World War II, having gone through World War II. So what is Darkseid? Darkseid's a tyrant. He has this whole planet, and he is looking literally for the anti-life equation, a way to wipe out free will, to kill whoever he wants in as massive ways as possible, and to rule over an empire of dust, to quote Anna Smith Sparks. Thanos is written by Jim Starlin after Vietnam. So what is Thanos? Thanos is a nihilist who worships death, who's in lust with death. Same kind of character, but the war that they went through changed their perspective on what evil actually was. And when I speak of Thanos, I speak of the comic book Thanos and not the Thanos of the MCU. Although I would say Infinity War's Thanos falls into sort of a grimdark mindset, right? Clearly he's evil because if he has unlimited power and the best he can come up with is the snap, there's no imagination there. Other Thanos in Endgame, I'm not really sure what happened there. But so, is it any wonder that Grimdark came about in the modern postmodern era? No, because postmodernism is about deconstructing and looking at the things of the past and, in a lot of ways, reacting to them. So we had Dunsany and Tolkien and Jordan. We can't have Grimdark reacting unless there's a baseline. And epic fantasy really, that's why we started there. That is our baseline. Yes, Heinlein versus Haldeman in sci-fi. When we get to sci-fi, we'll talk a little bit about that. So that is our sources look at Grimdarkness. We'll talk more on Tuesday about games that mechanically reinforce Grimdarkness and what things are we really looking at mechanically reinforcing. Spoiler alert, they're going to be things like brutal combat, horrible diseases, and moral ambiguity. We don't have alignments in Grimdark. We don't have safe, sanitary adventures. To quote my favorite line from the OSR primer, combat isn't sport, combat is war in Grimdark. There's no such thing as a fair fight. If you try and fight fair, you're just the next body to hit the floor. So, I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Grimdark, which is a weird thing for me to say. I love the Grimdark genre, and big thanks. This whole three episode block has a big thanks to Ben Feehan, who really was like, "Why do you like Grimdarkness?" on the way back from Gen Con. We talked about it for 2 or 3 hours and kind of helped me coalesce these thoughts. I know I'm just a huge downer, Bob. Huge downer. Yes, Phantom, I agree, except it's only like 5 years. Like, I think they only go back like 5 years, maybe even less than that. So the difference is, like, the Thanos we get at the start of Endgame, or the Thanos we get in Endgame isn't even the Thanos that we see at the start of Infinity War. Like, that's a lot of maturation to happen over, I mean, maybe not. There's just, for me, like, I understand the plot arc, I just don't connect the two characters in my head. So that's just probably on my fault. So that's what we have. We'll be back on Tuesday with the second part of our 3-part look at Grimdarkness. And hopefully we have the link to the Eternal Night of Lockwood. I bring that up only because it is grim and it literally has darkness in it. And Zweihander is one of the games we're definitely going to be looking at. And we have on Sunday night at 8, we're going to be talking with Rob of 13th Age, talking about 2nd edition 13th Age. So, we will see you all in a couple of days. I'll see you all on Tuesday. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope you have a wonderful time. If you decide to explore any of the series that I've posted on the Discord links that we've talked about here, let me know. Let me know your thoughts. I realize that Grimdark fantasy is not for everyone, but I felt if we were going through the fantasy genres, it's one of my favorites, and it's my show. So we were going to talk about it. So until then, I will see you all on Tuesday. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. Thanks to Phantom and Rook and Grom and Padre for joining in the discussion. And Mark, it's always good to see you. So until next time, have a good one.